The storage jar had been sitting in the silt for nearly 3,000 years. It was lying on its side at a slight angle, half buried beneath the floor of a lagoon on the Carmel coast of Israel. Its surface was encrusted with marine growth so thick that the diver who first touched it mistook it for a natural formation, a piece of reef, perhaps, or compacted sedite. But something about its geometry stopped him. The curve was too regular, the taper too deliberate. He fanned the sand with his hand, and the outline of a shoulder appeared, then a rim, then the ghost of a handle. He knew what he was looking at. This was cargo, and beneath it, somewhere deeper in the murk, lay the remains of a ship that had not sailed since the age of Solomon. What the divers at Tel Dor eventually uncovered was not just one vessel, it was three separate cargoes from 3 separate centuries preserved inside a single sheltered bay along the northern coast of what is now Israel. Individually, any one of them would have been significant. Iron Age shipwrecks are extraordinarily rare. Across the entire Mediterranean, fewer than a dozen were known before these finds. But taken together, the 3 wrecks at Dor did something far more consequential than add to a tally. They illuminated a period that maritime archaeology had almost entirely failed to see, a stretch of roughly 4 centuries after 1200 BC, when the Mediterranean record goes nearly silent. When the number of known shipwrecks drops to almost zero, and when the great seafaring networks that had connected Egypt to Anatolia, Crete to the Levant, and Cyprus to the Nile Delta appear, from the vantage of the seabed, to simply cease. That silence has a name, though it goes by several. Some call it the Greek Dark Ages, others refer to it as the post-collapse period, or simply the gap. Whatever the terminology, the reality it describes is extraordinary. Before roughly 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was one of the most interconnected zones on Earth. The Uluburun shipwreck, sunk off the Turkish coast around 1300 BC, carried goods from at least 7 different civilizations. 10 tons of Cypriot copper, tin likely from Afghanistan, ebony from Nubia, Baltic amber, Canaanite gold jewelry, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian scarabs, raw glass ingots of a blue so vivid they appeared almost synthetic. The ship was a floating summary of the Bronze Age world, cosmopolitan, commercially entangled, mutually dependent, and within a century of its sinking, that world was gone. The late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated catastrophes in ancient history. Around 1200 BC, in the space of perhaps a single generation, every major palatial civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either fell or contracted violently. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia was destroyed. Mycenaean Greece fragmented. The city-states of Ugarit, Alalakh, and Megiddo burned. Egypt survived, but barely, repelling incursions by the so-called Sea Peoples at great cost before entering a long decline. What caused this cascade is still unresolved. Scholars have proposed drought, earthquake storms, systemic failures in interconnected economies, internal revolts, piracy, and the disruption of tin supply routes. Likely, it was not any single factor, but a convergence of stresses that broke the system simultaneously at its weakest points. But whatever caused the collapse, its effects on the sea are unmistakable. The maritime trade routes that had sustained the Bronze Age, routes carrying copper, grain, textiles, luxury goods, diplomatic gifts, appear to disintegrate. Ports decline. Harbors go quiet. The archaeological record of the Mediterranean seabed, which is rich with Bronze Age and later Classical-era wrecks, contains an almost vacant interval between roughly 1150 and 750 BC. It is not that people stopped going to sea entirely during those centuries. They must have fished, crossed short distances, hugged the coastline. But the large-scale, multinational maritime commerce that had defined the previous era seems to vanish. The ships stop sinking in deep water because the ships stop venturing into deep water. This is the gap, and for decades it defined the limits of what maritime archaeology could tell us about the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. On land, excavators could trace the gradual recovery, new pottery styles, the slow spread of iron tools, the emergence of Phoenician script. But the sea offered almost nothing. The connection between civilization on shore and the vessels that linked those civilizations was severed, as if someone had cut a recording midway and pressed play again 4 centuries later with no explanation of what had changed. The ancient harbour of Dor sits on a low headland along the Carmel coast, about 30 kilometers south of Haifa. It was occupied for millennia, and its geography explains why. A series of small offshore islets create a natural lagoon, a protected anchorage that ancient mariners could enter even in foul weather. In the Bronze Age, Dor was a significant port. In the Iron Age, it would become a contested prize, passing through the hands of the Sekila, one of the Sea Peoples groups, then the Phoenicians, then the Kingdom of Israel, then the Assyrians, and eventually the Babylonians. Every empire that sought to control the Levantine coast understood that Dor was a hinge point. Whoever held it held access to a sheltered harbour on an otherwise exposed shoreline. It was precisely that shelter that preserved what the open sea had not. Sand and silt accumulated in the lagoon over millennia, burying whatever lay on its bottom in a low-oxygen environment hostile to decay. When marine archaeologists from the University of Haifa and the University of California, San Diego, began systematic underwater excavations in the lagoon in 2203 and 2044, they were mapping a harbour floor that had not been disturbed since antiquity. Using GPS-aligned three-dimensional imaging and precision dredging, they identified 3 distinct concentrations of material, each from a different period of the Iron Age, each representing the remains of a sunken merchant vessel. The earliest cargo, designated Dor M, dates to the 11th century BC. This places it barely a century after the collapse. At the time, Egypt was a shadow of its former self. The New Kingdom was over. The story of Wenamun, an Egyptian literary text from roughly this period, describes a priest dispatched to Byblos to purchase cedar for a temple barge. His account, whether factual or allegorical, depicts a Mediterranean in which Egypt commands no respect, in which local rulers mock Egyptian emissaries, and in which a once great civilization must negotiate humbly for goods it previously took by right. The seas of Wenamun's world are dangerous, fragmented and lawless. And yet, he travels by ship. He reaches Dor. He encounters traders. Commerce, however diminished, persists. Dor M corroborates this. Among the cargo the divers recovered were storage jars of a type found in Egypt, Cyprus, and Lebanon, alongside a stone anchor inscribed with Cypro-Minoan signs, the writing system used in Cyprus. These objects traveled. They crossed open water. They imply that within a generation or two of the collapse, someone was already reweaving the threads. Not the grand commercial tapestry of the Bronze Age, perhaps, but something. A beginning, a reconnection, a first tentative reach across the void. The second cargo, Dor L1, dates to the 9th or 8th century BC, when Dor was under Israelite control. The goods it carried were more modest, Phoenician-style storage jars and simple galley wares, the everyday ceramics of working sailors. Some of the bowls showed mending holes, evidence that the crew repaired their own equipment rather than replacing it. Compared to the exotic reach of Dor M, this cargo suggests a maritime world that had turned inward, regional rather than international, serving the coastal routes of the Levant rather than spanning the Mediterranean. The trade was real, but it was local, and it lacked the cosmopolitan ambition of what had come before. Then there is Dor L2, dated to the 7th or 6th century BC. It belongs to an era when Dor was once again Phoenician, now operating within the Assyrian and later Babylonian imperial systems. Its cargo is remarkable. Alongside Cypriot basket-handle amphorae, vessels used for transporting wine, oil, and resin, the divers recovered 9 iron blooms. These are semi-processed chunks of smelted iron, each weighing up to 10 kilograms. They constitute one of the earliest known maritime shipments of iron as a raw industrial material. If copper was the strategic metal of the Bronze Age, iron was its successor, and the presence of iron blooms in a ship's hold suggests that by the 7th century BC, the Mediterranean trade network had not merely recovered, it had transformed. It was carrying the materials of a new technological era. The ballast stones recovered from L2 are equally telling. Analysis revealed volcanic and quartz-rich samples that did not originate anywhere near the coast of Israel. They came from elsewhere in the Mediterranean, possibly far to the west. This means the ship had traveled not just along the coast but across the basin, before arriving in Dor's lagoon for the last time. 3 ships, 3 centuries, 1 harbor. What they describe, taken as a sequence, is not a sudden revival but a slow accretion, a process of maritime recovery that took hundreds of years and moved through distinct phases. First, the tentative re-establishment of basic long-distance contact, then a contraction into regional networks, and finally, a full reintegration into a Mediterranean-wide system carrying not just luxuries, but bulk industrial goods. The gap in the archaeological record was never total emptiness. It was a transition whose evidence had simply been too fragile, too rare, and too deeply buried to find. This matters beyond the specifics of the Iron Age. The pattern visible at Dor, collapse, silence, slow recovery, transformation, speaks to something persistent in the relationship between human civilization and the sea. Oceans do not merely connect societies, they amplify them. When a network of maritime trade functions, it accelerates everything: the movement of goods, the spread of ideas, the diffusion of technology, the accumulation of wealth. But when that network fails, the silence is not just economic, it is cognitive. Societies lose awareness of each other, technologies diverge, languages separate. The world, in a real and measurable sense, becomes smaller. The recovery, when it comes, is never a simple return. The Phoenician sailors who carried iron blooms across the sea in the 7th century BC were not recreating the Bronze Age. They were building something new, a maritime economy based on different metals, different scripts, different political structures. The Uluburun ship carried gifts between kings. The Dor L2 vessel carried raw material for blacksmiths. The nature of what moved across the water had changed because the civilizations on either shore had changed. There is a temptation when looking at the shipwreck record to read it as a simple graph. More wrecks meaning more trade, fewer wrecks meaning less. And in broad outline, this is defensible. The spike in Mediterranean wrecks during the Roman period, peaking in the 1st century BC, correlates with known commercial expansion. The drop, after the fall of Rome, correlates with known contraction. But the Dor discoveries complicate this reading. They remind us that the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, that a harbor can hold centuries of maritime history in its silt, invisible until someone thinks to look in the right place. They also remind us that the seabed is not neutral. It preserves selectively. Ships that sank in deep water on rocky substrates may have disintegrated completely. Ships that went down in harbors, in protected lagoons, in anoxic mud, those survived. The gap in the Iron Age record may reflect, at least in part, not that fewer ships sailed, but that fewer ships sank in places where they could be found. Or that the ships of that era were smaller, built differently, carrying cargoes less likely to survive. The record is real, but it is also shaped by what the sea chooses to keep. None of this diminishes the severity of the Bronze Age collapse. Something truly catastrophic happened around 1200 BC. The palace economies broke, the diplomatic networks dissolved, populations shifted, cities burned. But the discovery at Dor suggests that even in the darkest stretch of the Dark Ages, the sea was not entirely abandoned. Somewhere, someone loaded jars onto a boat, pushed off from shore, and sailed toward a harbor they hoped was still there. The fact that their vessel came to rest in the silt of Dor, and stayed there, waiting for 3,000 years, is not a footnote to history. It is the history itself, preserved in the most unforgiving archive there is. The excavations at Dor are not finished. Archaeologists believe that wooden hull fragments from one or more of the vessels may still lie beneath the sediment, deeper than the cargoes already recovered. If found, they would represent some of the only surviving structural remains of Iron Age ships in the eastern Mediterranean. Residue and isotope analysis of the jar contents is ongoing and may eventually reveal exactly what these vessels were carrying: wine, oil, resin, or something not yet suspected. In the meantime, the lagoon at Dor remains what it has always been: a quiet bay on a low coastline, bordered by the ruins of a city that outlasted empires. The water is shallow and clear. The islets that once sheltered Phoenician galleys from the open Mediterranean still break the swell. Beneath the surface, the sand holds what the centuries left behind. Not treasure, not spectacle, but the quiet, accumulating proof that even after the worst collapse the ancient world ever knew, someone went back to sea.